Chapter 12, Part 2. Governance. The politically exacerbated boom-to-bust cycle in renewables continues at the expense of humanity. Meanwhile, the fossil fuel system remains largely protected, with private and state-owned companies each earning year after year eye-watering 11-figure sum profits. And despite the IEA's net zero pathway statement that no new long lead time upstream oil and gas projects are needed, new oil and gas fields across the UK, Norway, and elsewhere continue to be licensed and financed with the comfort of ongoing government sponsorship and environmental impunity. Collectively, world governments want their cake and to be able to eat it as well. If one were designing a method of promoting one industry at the expense of another in the interest of the greater good, they would do the precise opposite to what is currently happening. Energy is an essential commodity. The free market for energy is a myth. It is controlled by fossil-owning states, some 30 very large private sector companies, and in many global markets, the incumbent utility companies. The world energy industry is effectively a cartel. It obeys none of the rules which are necessary for a free private sector-led market. Thus, on the one hand, we have the cartel which controls the energy in its own interests. Fossil fuel prices are largely controlled, and existing electricity markets are designed to deliver returns on investment for fossil fuel generation. On the other hand, we have the largely free market renewable industry, which, despite all the value it offers, is still consigned to the margins where tooth and claw competition is the norm. We believe we are looking at the complete failure of governance here. And we call time. It is time for citizens to demand the urgent changes necessary to realise the energy transition within science-based timelines. It is time for governments to marry renewable targets 5 and 10, 15 and 25 years from now with concrete steps to ensure the supply chain to deliver those targets is investable now. Policy failure. Accidental and deliberate. Governments should be able to impose policies which move the world's supply of energy in a sustainable direction. No amount of pious pledges at the grandiose climate COP process or ministers' environmentally orientated rhetoric compensate for the economic incentivization process needed to allow the renewable industry to compete on a level playing field with the fossil fuel industry. What have governments been doing? What are the policy mistakes that have been made since it became generally recognised that we had to move the world energy supply away from fossils? First, we must recognise the enormous power to influence wielded by the fossil fuel industry. It is insidious in civil and public life. Renowned climate scientist Michael E. Mann's highly acclaimed, meticulously researched book, The New Climate Wars, is illustrative in this regard. Policymakers themselves are influenced, directly and indirectly, by the massive investment the fossil fuel industry puts into public affairs. Between just 2000 and 2016, $2 billion has been invested by the US oil and gas majors in influencing policy in the US alone, rising to nearly $2.7 billion by 2023. In Europe, a figure of €250 million is recorded from 2010 to 2018. A staggering 2,456 fossil fuel lobbyists attended COP28 in 2023, up from the previous record of 638 set at COP27. Governments have been unknowingly or unwittingly misinformed and distracted for decades. Their imaginations captured by the non-solution solutions promoted expertly by the fossil fuel industry. Denial evolved to delay tactics, all designed to postpone the inevitable phase-out of fossil fuels. Designed to squeeze out as many more years as possible of earning tens of billions of dollars in profits annually. Not in total, but for each of the major companies. Distractions include carbon capture and storage, CCS, hydrogen as a presumptive Swiss Army knife of power instead of the highly specialist tool for select uses that it is, and natural gas, aka fossil gas, as a transition fuel. Whereas the suite of real solutions, with technical and economic merit, deliverable at scale in the required time frame, subject to political will, are those summarised by technical expert and decarbonisation futurist Michael Bernard in Chapter 13, Guidance for Policymakers and Investors. Towards solutions. So, what can governments the world over do to create a level playing field for the new renewable industry to be able to compete with fossils and deliver an energy transition aligned with the climate science? Key elements for intervention and international success stories. Firstly, they can stop subsidising fossil fuels. The IMF advise full fossil fuel price reform would reduce global carbon dioxide emissions to an estimated 43% below baseline levels in 2030, in line with keeping global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, while raising revenues worth 3.6% of global GDP and preventing 1.6 million local air pollution deaths per year. Secondly, they can recognise and reward the multifaceted value provided by renewable energy, principally that it is clean, secure, locally or regionally sovereign, and price stable. Thirdly, they can go further to impose penalties for negative externalities. The polluter pays. A series of economic studies are now emerging. One published in Nature in April 2024 quantifies projected damage due to the climate crisis as 6 times the cost of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius, reducing global GDP by 19% by mid-century. Fourthly, in the European context, they can intentionally support a domestic industry which is critical to European clean energy security and European competitiveness in the form of stable energy prices, the European wind manufacturing industry. To achieve the financial stability this sector requires to deliver on the region's climate imperative, there must first be recognition of, firstly, the strategic importance of wind as a major source of clean, reliable generation in Europe, to complement solar and other forms of renewable generation throughout the year and all day long, and then secondly, the delicate financial position of European wind turbine manufacturers due to the structural lack of profitability in the sector, for all the reasons expanded in this chapter. Such intentional interventions work, especially when monetary, fiscal, industrial, public health, environmental, and energy policies are considered coherently to drive the required transition to clean, secure, affordable energy for all. The exponential growth of renewable energy deployment and related industrial growth in China is a case in point. It is the global leader in wind and solar, with both the largest absolute generation and the highest annual additions for over a decade. In the Chinese case, a crisis in air quality and public health served to catalyse a transformation of their economy. In her highly acclaimed 2024 book, Not the End of the World, data scientist Hannah Rich, begins the chapter on air pollution, contrasting the poor air quality at the 2008 Beijing Olympics to the blue skies and smog-free air enjoyed when Beijing hosted the 2022 Winter Olympics. When public anger at the air apocalypse boiled over in 2013, with ever-worsening fatal PM 2.5 air pollution events, the Chinese government were forced to declare a war on pollution the following year, and tough regulations ensued. But it wasn't all stick. Far-reaching green finance guidelines to stimulate demand and investment in replacement non-polluting technologies were drafted in 2015 to 2016 by Dr. Ma Zhan and implemented in 2017. In a 2004 interview with Michael Liebrich, Zhan described the Chinese central bank as having a clear mandate to facilitate and support structural transformation, including green transformation, to stimulate reallocation of resources, especially capital, to green activities. As well as cleaning up the air and improving public health, by 2023, the total effect of the focused policies was to transform the country's industry and economy, creating a strategic powerhouse for green manufacture and export for solar, storage, and EV technologies. According to Ember, clean energy has become the top driver of China's economic growth. It accounted for over half of all new wind and solar gigawatts installed globally. In parallel, it has learned to manage transition pain points such as curtailment, now boasting enviable curtailment rates of 2 to 3% due to their strategic build-out of grid infrastructure. And many analysts suggest the renewable energy generation growth rate means it has already reached peak emissions in 2024, well ahead of its 2030 target. By contrast to China, central banks elsewhere still have no mandate to support a green transformation, viewing stimulation of resource allocation as undesirable market distortion. But Zhan states the case clearly. Climate change is the area of most visible externality, which means that the market does not really work in this particular space, and you need to correct that market failure by government policy instruments, including central bank instruments. The Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is the other shining example of where government intervenes to accelerate sustainable development. It is modelled and implemented with a focus on achieving net zero emissions. Europe needs to take note of this latest US stratagem and do the same for its own sustainable industry. The EU has criticised the US for this distortion of trade, without understanding the need to correct market failure in its own energy industry. Within Europe, the Netherlands may be the most successful example to date. It has long-running financial incentives which produce a stable environment for investors, and top-down policies in line with medium-term legally binding targets. But all timeframes and actions now must be extended for full decarbonisation. Ultimately, a cohesive strategy for real, effective decarbonisation in time to avoid catastrophic climate change requires not only ambitious climate policy, but intentional energy policy, monetary and fiscal policy, all focused to deliver a clearly envisioned, fully decarbonised economy by 2050. And air quality. We must plan with that fully formed vision of the future we desire in mind now and create the market signals to achieve it. While some economies have made decent progress so far, perhaps none are on track yet. In the West, we are still so far off the pace of deployment needed that it must be clear that we will not deliver the radical acceleration without radical changes to redress a system which is not yet fit for the purpose. a shift to a more Keynesian economic approach to energy markets, externalities, and industry support suggests itself. EU electricity market reform. Precipitated by the 2022 energy crisis and finalised in May 2024, the latest EU electricity market reform represents an opportunity not yet taken to fundamentally design markets that are fit for purpose for the energy transition, to secure long-term delivery of clean, secure, affordable and price-stable energy to all consumers in Europe. As described by European economic think tank Bruegel, the reform took place at a time of record-high consumer electricity prices in Europe, while many utilities were earning record profits, and it aimed to address two key problems. 1. The issue of fairness for stakeholders, and 2. Clear investment signals for the technologies needed to decarbonise the power system. Price volatility, as seen with the 2022 gas crisis, results in extremes. The concentration of high-stakes winners paid for by the many losers. It is perhaps not surprising that immediate emergency circumstances resulted in a focus on consumer protection, with little progress towards establishing a roadmap to a decarbonised economy. The resulting reform established 1. A common emergency mechanism under the supervision of the EU, where potential aid to consumers would be provided as a flat rate, aiming not to distort price signals in the market. 2. CFDs as the reference mechanism to provide price stability to generators and cost stability to consumers. These may be applied to new renewable energy investments and in existing nuclear plant. However, Esade Ekpol Centre for Economic Policy highlight in their analysis that this reform can be considered a non-reform in that it does not align the structure of the European electricity market with the needs of a system with a high penetration of renewables. They note that the reform falls short in several key aspects. 1. While recognising the importance of long-term market-based instruments for renewables, it fails to develop efficient European markets for their integration. 2. CFDs, its central instrument, are intended more as government support than as market tools accessible to all stakeholders. 3. The lack of standardisation in the capacity and flexibility markets allows member states to design divergent approaches, potentially distorting the European single market. There remain, they say, two primary unresolved issues. 1. How to encourage the necessary investment in large-scale renewable energy projects in the context of structurally low day-ahead prices, i.e., avoid cannibalisation due to the current merit order and marginal pricing in wholesale markets. 2. How to incentivise investment in technologies that offer flexibility on both the supply and demand sides, but whose revenues in the wholesale market will not reflect the real value they offer to the system. It is clear from this that mechanisms for long-term revenue stabilisation for renewable energy are still required, along with flexibility markets that provide investment certainty for zero-emissions solutions in particular. The 2024 reform was heralded as a milestone towards a carbon-free and greener future for all by Tin van der Straten, yet there is much work still to be done. Critics, including the Greens negotiator Michael Bloss, described the new text as a small reform, saying the finished law does not deliver what it set out to, the foundation of a 100% renewable power system. Further significant reform is needed, urgently, to increase the resilience of the electricity system while adapting to the needs of a decarbonised society, and combine efficiency and decarbonisation in industrial policy to enhance European competitiveness. As Asade Ekpol suggests, the ultimate goal should be the creation of a harmonised and long-term focused European electricity market. Again, we call time. Time for intention, ambition, and decisive action. Time for pan-European models, considering the benefits of the supergrid to the whole system, to inform the optimal end state and step plan. To have security in our ambition, it is vital to understand the nature of the key renewable energy, storage, and enhanced grid technologies. They are modular and scalable, with steep experience curves. These are the key tools we have available to realise the energy transition during this critical decade. They stand ready to deliver at speed and scale, but they need to be given the chance. State and EU regional energy market design is deliberate. It is a political choice. The time is now to make the choice, to envision the market of the decarbonised future we all need and want, to create the investment signals now, and to implement the plans to take us there. Recommendations for Europe. Some of the policy changes that could be deployed to address the current blockages to decarbonisation of the European power sector are set out below. Following the analysis in this chapter, these principles are the standout requirements, which, in our view, have not yet been given the required attention. Given the strategic importance of wind for Europe, as discussed throughout this book, and the challenges in its supply chain presented in this chapter, there is consequently a particular focus on creating an investable scenario for wind and a financially sustainable future for wind OEMs in Europe. Of course, care should be taken to ensure the correct investment signals for all truly clean technologies, notably those identified as high merit in Chapter 13, Guidance for Policymakers and Investors. 1. Stop subsidising fossil fuels. 2. Decouple renewable energy permanently from fossil fuel prices. 3. Fix prices for renewable energy. 4. Provide grant funding to European wind turbine manufacturers from Europe. 5. Route some of the carbon taxes to the wind industry. 6. Recognise that the future of wind in Europe is largely offshore, and the role of government to de-risk development to reduce final costs to consumers. 7. Invest strategically at the European level in R&D and innovation for renewable and enabling technologies. 8. Raise public money for enabling infrastructure. Provide a phased support scheme for the supergrid. 9. Recognise the urgency of transformative change, the need for central coordination at the European level, and the benefits of standardisation. 1. Stop subsidising fossil fuels. Subsidy reform, as proposed by the IMF, it states raising fuel prices to their fully efficient levels reduces projected global fossil fuel CO2 emissions 43% below baseline levels in 2030, or 34% below 2019 emissions. This reduction is in line with the 25 to 50% reduction in global greenhouse gases below 2019 levels needed by 2030 to be on track with containing global warming to the Paris goal of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. The required ingredients they suggest include a comprehensive energy sector reform plan, phased-in price increases, improving the efficiency of state-owned enterprises, measures to protect the poor, and the introduction of automatic pricing mechanisms that depoliticize energy pricing. 2. Decouple renewable energy permanently from fossil fuel prices. Renewable energy costs are wholly, fundamentally, independent of fossil fuel price. One is predominantly based on capital costs known before construction starts. The other is highly volatile, and as we have seen, is a product of some combination of cartel price setting, often politically driven state decisions, and market manipulation. OPEC Plus sets a price for oil, which has little to do with customer demand, and everything to do with maximizing profits. Fossil fuel generation has been characteristically volatile since the first oil crisis of 1979. Fossil-based energy has furthermore been a political tool since that time, and it has driven inflation, in particular during the upcoming years of necessary and COP28 agreed phase down, eventually phase out. Periods of extreme fossil fuel volatility should be expected. To this end, interested readers will find the classic Competitive Strategy, Techniques for Analyzing Industries and Competitors, Chapter 12, Competitive Strategy in Declining Industries, by Michael E. Porter, recognized as the father strategy, highly instructive. Both consumers and renewable energy generators should be protected from the ensuing turmoil. Our economies should be decoupled from its inflationary effects. Neither the price of renewable energy nor its downside market risks should ever be linked to the volatile price of fossil fuels, in which renewable energy generators have no influence or control. Options to realise a permanent decoupling include immediate separation of wholesale markets into fossil-fuelled markets and zero-carbon clean renewable energy markets. In the fully decarbonised world of the future, all forms of generation will be renewable. So why delay in establishing a new form of wholesale market that is entirely fit for purpose from the outset? This is not a new idea. Dual market proposals were made by the Greek government and assessed during the EU energy market reform in 2022, for example. But such radical, fundamental restructuring of the European electricity markets was evidently determined not feasible in the timeframe. Discussion of the option was provided by Bruegel in September 2022, and we suggest this is revisited now, alongside fixing a price for renewables, other recommendations set out in this book, and an acknowledgement of technological progress in the interim, which changes the techno-economic basis of solutions to residual challenges. A dual market proposal was also made by Michael Liebrich, and University College London's Institute for Sustainable Resources is engaged in a programme of research examining options for reforming electricity markets, focusing on how a green power pool may be designed and operated. The split market concept is considered as part of the UK's ongoing Review of Electricity Market Arrangements, or EMA, which aims to support decarbonisation of the system by 2035. At time of writing, the latest consultation documents issued in that process, under the Sunak Conservative government in May 2024, suggest that no such market, split by characteristic, would be pursued. Perhaps this position can change under the new administration. It should be self-evident that radical or fundamental restructuring from first principles is indeed necessary for a decarbonised economy. Indeed, Bruegel acknowledges that dual markets will require thorough analysis when the policy debate switches focus to long-term energy market reform, which should be now. No energy is produced at zero cost. Hence, the preposterous marginal prices of zero would never be a feature in the new renewable energy market. Some minimum prices would be required to be set in consideration of the value attributes of clean power discussed in this chapter. and acknowledgement of the cost of capital. In this system, dispatch would always be prioritised from the renewable energy market. Perhaps as a just transition, capacity repayments which strategically reduce over time may be required for the existing fossil fuel plant. This would consider, among other things, the various stages of amortization of the set of existing fossil fuel generation plants, their economics, and utility for grid stability and balancing. This should only be as a transitional period measure, however, with clear emphasis given to prioritising resources and public investment to create the enabling environment for clean forms of system reliability and security, with newer technologies as the more permanent solutions. Such permanent solutions would include battery storage-enabled dispatchable generation and grid flexibility markets, demand-side management or load shifting, including education and engagement campaigns for behavioural change, and deeper interconnection towards the supergrid, all of which require clear investment signals and intentional government support in various forms. A holistic all-system approach needs to be considered to optimise for clean, secure, affordable and price-stable power for all, what we call the energy trifecta. As an example, battery storage as grid balancing for solar or wind are always more cost-effective when included as system balancing rather than project-level balancing. Obviously, this new system will take time to ramp up, but the clean technologies are commercially available to scale today, with new innovations emerging all the time, a process that will accelerate with the right government signals. The desired, fully decarbonised end state and transition phase pathways still need to be modelled in a clean, technology-agnostic way, articulated, planned for, and supported through market designs which will drive innovation and allow the best clean solutions to compete on a level playing field and flourish. 3. Fix prices for renewable energy. Set a price for onshore and offshore wind-generated electricity in particular, enough to create an incentive to encourage investment at the speed and scale required. The second most valuable attribute of renewable power, after being clean, is its potential for cost stabilisation, but only if prices are fixed. Assuming separate markets are created for renewable energy and fossil fuel generation, perhaps a fixed price does not need to be set for solar, though this should be analysed with learnings from other markets. The challenges they experienced with rapid solar build-out, grid issues, duck curves, etc., e.g. in Vietnam, California, Chile, and what is being done to successfully overcome this. Any proposed differentiation in approach to pricing is in the context of expert opinion, such as that of Jenny Chase, that solar will get built anyway, but wind needs some help. As she discussed in a July 2024 interview with Michael Liebrecht, there are fundamental differences between the semiconductor technology of solar, which may still have room for cost improvements, and the mechanical technology of wind. Solar manufacturers are doing things better all the time. There are lots of people far smarter than us, working in factories and research labs all over the world, finding ways to grind every fraction of a cent out of the cost of making a solar module, and they are really good at it. That is what the experience curve is. It's lots of people finding ways to cut the cost, and so they kept doing that. Unlike fossil fuel-generated electricity, the cost of energy produced by a wind or solar plant for its entire 20-year-plus design life is known at final investment date, before the start of construction. The vast majority of total lifetime costs, TOTEX, are the upfront capital cost of construction, including financing costs, CAPEX. Operating costs, OPEX, for wind are relatively small in the round, as a percentage of TOTEX. And the few potentially significant OPEX components that could be volatile, such as insurance, could be indexed. OPEX is a bit more material for solar than wind, but again, indexation can address any uncertainty for the investors and lenders. This means that in the desired end state of a fully decarbonised economy, aside from specific indexed OPEX items, there is no good reason why the price of fossil fuel-free generation should be variable to any significant degree. Effectively, it is known. Fixing prices for renewable energy would be the simplest and most impactful method of support, and should be done, given the scale of the challenge and acknowledging that the current market in energy is long corrupted. There are many ways it can be done, providing certainty of investment in renewables by rapidly updating European market norms, a fixed premium to account for the value delivered and capital costs, carbon taxes that are fit for purpose, categorising decarbonisation technologies as exempt or different from others in terms of state aid and tax credits. Two-way CFDs attempt to provide a structured form of fixed price, but in the context of existing mixed fossil fuel and renewable energy markets, where in Europe it is often the cost of gas that sets the marginal price. We argue it is simpler to have them separated from the start. Again, the price of renewable power is not variable. It is known as FID. Two-way CFDs may achieve the goal of fixing the price, but they are a convolution, with ongoing administrative overhead and associated cost, both for the clearing market administration and the generators. As these will be redundant in the fully decarbonised context, we suggest a rethink of this approach to achieve a fixed price that works independently of the markets designed to trade and support fossil fuels. A reimagination from first principles. So, how to set the fixed price? The levelised cost of electricity generation in Europe is in the order of €0.08. In good wind speed areas, a competitively arrived at price for onshore wind-generated electricity has been in the range of €0.04 to €0.06, though this has increased due to capital and financing cost increases, as discussed earlier in the chapter, and so expert modelling would be needed periodically to reflect financing or material cost changes for new installed capacity, while price contracted more than a year in advance should be indexed up to FID. Modelling methods are standard in the industry, and so establishing the institutional capacity at state and EU level would be straightforward, with industry input on cost inputs. For the purpose of the current example, though, let's use the €0.04 to €0.06 range for onshore wind, noting that offshore wind is higher, which suggests a price of €0.07 or even €0.075 would create surpluses and profits for developers and OEMs. For solar, Jenny Chase gives a range of $30 to $60 per megawatt hour in 2024, which depends where you are, how sunny it is, and what your cost of capital is, meaning what return an investor would need to invest in that project. The best metric is probably that today you can buy a good solar module for about 10 US cents a watt. You can buy a solar module for the cost of about 10 cups of coffee. At any of these prices, all renewables would still be cheaper than fossil fuel prices in Europe. We can imagine economists objecting to this because it doesn't meet the smell test. What would Adam Smith think of this arrangement? Classic economists, including Smith, almost never took externalities into account. In this case, almost the entire rationale for using wind and solar is about the externalities that the use of fossil fuel entails. However, notwithstanding the fact that Adam Smith was not confronted by the supreme externality, that is the climate crisis, he understood that societies have needs that cannot be simply left to the market. This is where government and public institutions must lead. As Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations, the third and last duty of the sovereign or commonwealth is that of erecting and maintaining those public institutions and those public works, which, though they may be in the highest degree advantageous to a great society, are, however, of such a nature that the profit could never repay the expense to any individual or small number of individuals. There are many arguments in favour of this approach. The price of circa 7 cents for wind can be set for 20 years, to at least 2045. The turbines and solar panels will last pretty indefinitely, with minor replacements. So after 20 years, this price drops to the variable cost of production, rents, rates, operations, and maintenance costs, but significantly no charge for fuel. Paying this price gets investment going and builds an infrastructure which serves society in the long term. Setting a price in this manner does not interfere with competition between OEMs. Unlike protectionist strategies, which falsely limit imported technology, missing the opportunities to benefit from global technology improvements. To close our markets to foreign technology is to put the brakes on our own transition to decarbonisation and competitiveness, and pressures to do this must be resisted. Each OEM will still innovate to win contracts and maximise profits. It is difficult to see European wind OEMs surviving without this, or perhaps other similar schemes. Wind energy farms will continue to be built, but manufacturing will happen more and more in China, or perhaps the US, as it already does for solar PV, batteries and EVs, and, as Wood Mackenzie have suggested, trouble resulting from the same competitive forces which have injured Western OEMs may be on the horizon for their Chinese counterparts. 4. Provide grant funding to European wind turbine manufacturers from Europe. The wind turbine manufacturer patient is so ill at this stage that direct grants, like the €560 million that was recently given to the wind energy company Enercon by the German government, need to be made available to ensure the survival of the European wind industry. At a time when investment is needed to be doubled at least, SGRE announced that they were laying off staff. These grants and subsidies are the cheapest way of supporting the industry overall, as long as balanced with the overall need to deliver operational megawatts. 5. Route some of the carbon taxes to the wind industry, enabling technologies and infrastructure. Carbon taxes are, quite rightly, routed towards the poorer off in society, who are disproportionately affected by such taxes. They are often used to enhance innovation funds, and that is a laudable activity. The encouragement of investing in renewable energy is the highest human need for the coming 30 or 40 years. It is a good use of the money derived from implementing the polluter pays principle. A. Provide subsidies and grant funding to European wind turbine manufacturers from Europe. For every unit of renewable electricity produced, a direct subsidy could be paid to the relevant wind energy OEM. The unthinking economist would argue that this is anti-competitive. The opposite is in fact the case, as it stimulates an emerging market. We have already seen the success of these kinds of support mechanisms in enabling a nascent solar PV industry to grow and develop into today's huge success story, where no further subsidy is required. In this case, we are suggesting that instead of a feed-in tariff type subsidy, there should instead be a payment to OEMs, which will help secure a vibrant and healthy supply chain. Such a subsidy is required to help level the playing field that has long been tilted in favour of fossil producers. As we have seen, renewable energy generation is a price taker. On the other hand, the competition, the fossil fuel industry, manipulate pricing to whatever OPEC Plus and state-owned entities want. It is in no way reflective of efficient costs of production. The recent agreement between Saudi Arabia and Russia is a visible testament to the non-competitive, indeed anti-competitive, nature of the oil and gas industry. A direct subsidy to the wind industry would redress the utterly anti-competitive nature of the current energy payment system. B. Recognise that the future of wind in Europe is largely offshore, and the role of government to de-risk development to reduce final costs to consumers. Of late, governments have begun to charge exorbitant rents for leases of offshore areas. The most florid example of this occurred in the UK, where one offshore wind site was leased to an oil company, which involved it flexing its exorbitant financial muscle, paying £3.2 billion before they get planning permission and compete for a contract to supply electricity. European governments can minimise the risk for developers and OEMs by both speeding up the consenting process and charging for the leasing of offshore property when a contract for electricity has been won and there is cash flow to pay for the lease. There have been benefits to the last 20 years of lease auction, but the regime needs to adapt to the new realities. C. EU investment in R&D and innovation for renewable and enabling technologies. The wind turbine manufacturer industry has grown from small 250 kilowatt or 2.5 megawatt machines to 16 megawatt over a 30-year period. Each iteration in design costs in the order of €250 million and has resulted in more power per turbine and cheaper electricity. It would be entirely appropriate to subsidise each new investment from EU research and development funds. This would require realigning categories of R&D funding eligibility to extend existing profitable companies for as long as the climate emergency lasts, and for as long as the external supply chain for this strategic industry is at risk. We are now moving from fixed foundation offshore turbines to floating ones as deeper water with higher wind speeds are being accessed. This area needs rapid investment to succeed in time to reach its critical potential. D. Raise public money for enabling infrastructure. Provide a phased support scheme for the supergrid. One of the major costs to the renewable industry is that associated with grid connections. So far, these connections have been directly from the offshore wind farm to the nearest strong point on the grid. As the wind farms move further offshore, up to 40% of the capex cost of the delivered power is due to the cable connection and associated offshore and onshore substation investments. As Europe comes to rely more and more on offshore wind, this interconnection challenge moves to the centre stage. As Europe enters the supergrid era, an enhanced planning arrangement is needed to achieve two distinct activities: building wind farms and connecting via a new offshore grid to where the customers will use the power. In the beginning, the early legs of the supergrid will have to be heavily subsidised and costs socialised across all future beneficiaries, European consumers, not just those in adjacent markets. It is interesting to note that the point-to-point connector between Ireland and France, the so-called Celtic interconnector, is subsidised. With a cost of nearly €1.6 billion, the Celtic interconnector will be significantly funded by the EU, who will pay for around €530 million of the bill. Connecting Europe is the rationale for this subsidy. This rationale will be even more reinforced by the supergrid, as it is the electrical superhighway which unites the whole of Europe. It is completely in line with the philosophy of Jean Monnet, that of mutual interdependence and solidarity. A similar approach could even be applied at the EU state or regional level, for ports, transmission, and possibly distribution. 6. Recognition of the urgency of transformative change, the need for central coordination at the EU level, and the benefits of standardisation. We cannot increment our way out of the climate crisis in time. A coordinated, standardised and modularised approach is needed. Creeping renationalisation of energy needs to be addressed to facilitate enhanced EU energy market integration. Coordinating regional standards in things like CFDs, PPAs, flexibility markets, and any other new markets or instruments to promote investment in renewable energy, zero-emissions grid balancing and flexibility can be preliminary steps. As described by the economic think tank Bruegel, the multiple benefits of enhanced EU energy market integration should be emphasised. Techno-economic benefits can be secured from optimising the design and operation of several national electricity systems jointly, rather than individually. These benefits will increase massively with higher shares of renewables and include less fossil fuel burn and less volatile short-term prices, cost savings through harnessing regional renewables advantages, reduced need for expensive backup capacity and flexibility, and enhanced resilience to shocks. In addition, greater energy market integration will trigger benefits of a more managerial governance-related nature. Though these are harder to quantify, they include benefits in terms of competition, innovation, and credibility, which are particularly useful in the energy sector, which typically faces rather long investment times and high degrees of concentration in purely national markets. The transformative changes described here and preparation for a single electricity market require backwards master planning from the desired end state by 2050, with clearly signposted milestones to provide investment certainty, including prioritising zero emissions in dispatch and interconnector trading rules. The recent attempt at EU energy market reform did not attempt to bridge to the decarbonised end state, and missed the opportunity to provide the required long-term investment signals to unblock the dam previously described as the wall of capital, ready to fund net zero. It is worth remembering that financial modelling of any renewable energy or transmission asset for investment decisions today already include revenue and cost assumptions beyond 2050. As discussed elsewhere in this book, the principles of mega-project planning should be applied not only for planning infrastructure required, the mega programme of mega-projects, which is the supergrid, but also the system of markets towards the future single electricity market, which creates the enabling environment for the trillions of euros of investment required to deliver the new generation transmission, storage, and port infrastructure. Conclusion. The time for change is running out. Pollution by the oil and gas companies has created a poisoned environment. They need to be held accountable for their actions, Not a penny in carbon tax finds its way into the coffers of wind turbine manufacturers. The required level of investment in new renewable energy capacity is lagging behind the rate to decarbonise our energy systems, with a science-based timeframe by a factor of 2 to 3. We are looking at complete failure of governance here by European and global governments. Energy market design is ultimately a political choice. The desired end state for a fully decarbonised single electricity market, which delivers clean, secure, affordable and price-stable energy for all of Europe, should determine a market redesign roadmap to support and promote the levels of investment required to realise that transformation now, and with milestones over the next 25 years to 2050. The latest EU energy market reform did not get this job done. Along with the Inflation Reduction Act as an industrial policy, we are bold enough to suggest that Chinese green finance guidelines and other top-down Chinese policy implementation measures will be instructive as case studies for the Commission, European governments, and central banks. Crises such as the Chilean paradox should serve as a cautionary tale to promote anticipatory grid expansion and ongoing curtailment mitigation if the trillions of private investment required is to be unlocked in good time. It is critical to protection of our way of life as Europeans, to clean air and the public health of our citizens, and to the energy security, competitiveness, and economic health of our region, that progress on renewable energy deployment is not left to flounder under some misguided insistence on unfettered free market economics. Today's energy markets are anything but free and never were. They are failing European citizens and the decarbonised future we desire. Now is the time for citizens to demand that all barriers to rapid deployment of clean, secure, price-stable and affordable energy are lifted, and it is time for our policymakers to step up and save the day. Chapter Key Points. 1. Energy is critical to society, and the urgent decarbonisation of our economies by 2050 is critical to our civilization, in line with climate science. 2. A free market for energy is a dangerous myth. Circa 80% of fossil fuel supply comes from government-owned companies who set their own agenda in light of the political climate, while OPEC Plus members collude to set a price that suits their needs. B. Even in so-called deregulated electricity markets, neither wholesale nor retail markets are free of complex evolving rules and state interventions. C. Today, prices awarded in the wholesale markets are largely driven by gas or other volatile fossil fuels, which, as discussed above, are not free of political influence. Other forms of market manipulation are well evidenced. D. Governments directly and implicitly drive subsidies for fossil fuels, meanwhile taking excise duties and influencing the spark price with heating energy tax policies misaligned with decarbonisation goals. 3. Cheap fossil fuels are a myth. According to the IMF, they were subsidised by $7 trillion in 2022. 4. Benefiting from this subsidy, on the back of ordinary taxpayers during a period of inflationary stress on their pocketbooks, as well as market designs that entrench the status quo, fossil fuel companies are recording record profits. Just 8 of the top oil and gas producers recorded $388 billion in total profits in 2022, and another $270 billion in 2023. Those 8 companies could probably pay for the European supergrid outright from retained earnings generated in 3 to 4 years. 5. Fossil fuel companies are state-owned or have vast resources to spend on influencing EU and national governments. They do this to the tune of at least €30 million per year in Europe. The US figure was $133 million in the US in 2023. Evidence of their influence in climate change solution delay is well documented. 6. Wind and solar generated electricity currently subsidize the price of electricity generated by fossil fuels in the form of unrecognized externalities, and in some markets, also through their exposure to fossil fuel price volatility. 7. Meanwhile, over 900 megawatts of wind power per week must be built in Europe from now to 2050 to realise committed decarbonisation targets. In 2021 and 2023, just 327 megawatts and 352 megawatts per week were built, with even less in 2022. A. To meet the decarbonisation target, the wind turbine industry needs to at least double in capacity, i.e., double investment, but no financier will invest in a losing business. 8. The unsuitability of current wholesale and forward markets for project-financed assets largely limits renewable energy developers in competing with each other as price takers in hyper-competitive auctions and tenders for electricity contracts. The auction system, which has become the norm in awarding public procurement contracts, is monstrously unfair to both the wind turbine generators, WTGs, and developers, with poor risk to return, as evidenced by recent undersubscribed and failed auctions across the globe. 9. Energy markets evidence acute market failures when seen through the lens of the need to supply clean, secure, affordable and price-stable electricity to all consumers. Failures include A. Externalities. The subsidization of fossil fuels by renewable energy. B. Price cannibalization. C. Uncompensated value attributes, wholesale cost reduction and price stability. D. Structurally unfair risk allocation. E. The uniform unprofitability of the wind original equipment manufacturing (OEM) sector, despite its critical importance to decarbonisation. F. A vicious cycle. Underinvestment in quality-worsening financial woes of OEMs. G. Failed auctions. H. Discriminatory impact of higher interest rates for renewables versus other forms of generation. I. Curtailment and dispatch down or underutilisation. 10. Structurally, the deck is stacked. To allow decarbonisation to happen at the pace needed and ensure energy security for the region, and to unlock the opportunities for competitiveness, each government and EU institution must intervene to correct this. We recommend the following principles should be included in deep energy market reforms during the current administration. A. Stop subsidising fossil fuels. Move the money. B. Decouple the price paid for renewables permanently from that paid for fossil fuels. Renewable energy is the only component of the energy sector which can guarantee fixed future prices. Recognise the inherent value of renewables, whose primary fuel is free, and the value of price certainty to all customers. C. Fix a price for renewable electricity that provides a pollution-adjusted rate of return sufficient to attract the needed investment and prices positive and negative externalities. D. Route a percentage of carbon taxes raised to the wind industry and enabling technologies and infrastructure. 1. Provide grant funding to European wind turbine manufacturers from Europe. 2. Recognise that the future of wind in Europe is largely offshore, and the role of government to de-risk development to reduce final costs to consumers. 3. EU investment in R&D and innovation for renewable and enabling technologies. 4. Raise public money for enabling infrastructure. Provide a phased support scheme for the supergrid. E. Recognise the urgency of transformative change, the need for central coordination at the European level, and the benefits of standardisation.